Hi, my name is Sydney Rankmore. I'm an associate planner with RIC Engineering, and I'm a board member with the APA San Diego chapter. I have with me here today Gail Goldberg. She is the former planning director of the City of San Diego and the City of LA, and she's currently a fellow with the American Institute of Certified Planners. Gail, welcome.
Thank you, Sydney. It's fun to be here.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Start off with that.
Well, I grew up in Southern California, so I am a Southern Cal gal. I lived in the Inland Empire as I grew up, but moved to San Diego in 1972, so I feel like this is home for me. I was a very happy housewife playing tennis, and sort of midlife decided to go back to college and create a career for myself.
Wow. That's amazing. So why did you choose planning then?
Well, actually, I didn't initially choose planning. Initially, I chose economics. And I suspect, in retrospect, that's because it sounded like a serious major. And it was not until my fourth year at UCSD, majoring in economics, that it finally sort of occurred to me that an economist in San Diego with strong socialist leanings probably wasn't a good prospect for earning a living. And in my fourth year at Third College, now Thurgood Marshall, they required a planning class. I think there were 2 required planning classes. And when I took those classes, it became very clear to me that this was the place that I think I fit better. I like communities. I like politics. I love the whole idea of creating environments for people to live in. I think all planners are sort of environmental determinists. We believe we are where we live. And so it was a very happy discovery for me. So, of course, I took another year, much to my children's delight, because it was their excuse to also take 5 years to graduate from college.
Well, can you tell me a little bit more about how that led you to the City of San Diego?
Well, in my senior year at UCSD, they required an internship. And so I applied for an internship at the city, and there were only 2. And I do remember the interview, which was very daunting, with 5 or 6 people. And they asked us to come a half an hour before the interview. And I remember that they put me into a room with stacks of zoning codes, and then gave me an assignment for a presentation that I would need to make at Planning Commission. And the first thing that occurred to me was I had nothing or any idea what to do with those books of zoning codes. That was not part of my education at UCSD, so I knew that was not going to help me. It did occur to me as an older student with perhaps a little more confidence in public speaking, that likely they wanted to learn from me how I reacted in a public setting or how comfortable I was in a presentation. Mm-hmm. So instead of solving the problem they gave to me, I did a whole presentation on how I would solve the problem, what my process would be. And fortunately got the job in community planning, which was a very happy event for me. Yeah.
Well, so starting with the City of San Diego, can you speak about some of your most memorable projects?
Oh, at the City of San Diego, before I became planning director, I ended up with the city doing large projects. And for many reasons, not the least of which I think was that I was older. And developers seemed more comfortable with someone that they assumed had more experience, I think. But I was good at projects because I was good at getting people to help me. And in planning, that's the trick. Mm-hmm. I mean, planning requires that you get a lot of people to help you. And I ended up doing a project that I have loved and is one of my favorite till today. For 5 years, I worked on base closure and was ultimately the planning manager for the reuse of the Naval Training Center and now Liberty Station. So I love going there. I love watching how it's used. It was not an easy project because of all the constraints on the land there. I mean, the high noise, the Tidelands Trust, the Historic Corps, so many constraints. But it's turned out to be just a wonderful community asset. And I love going there and seeing everybody using it so much.
As do I.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful asset to the community. Yeah. And how about the city of LA?
Well, the city of LA was a bit more of a challenge. Remembering that when I left San Diego in 2005, I left the first month of a mayor's new term and the first month of a charter change that changed the city of San Diego from a city manager form of government to a strong mayor. So I went from all of my experience was a general manager form, which I loved. And going to LA, I was immediately thrown into a much more political environment with a strong mayor form of government. And the other big change for me in Los Angeles that was a challenge is that for all of the complaints in San Diego from communities having a say, communities in San Diego, when I left, had a strong infrastructure through the community planning group process. Every community had a community planning group that took care of their community planning area. And it was a wonderful way to interact with the community from a planning perspective. And we did a really good job in San Diego of training our community planning groups, you know, through training on CEQA and training on their responsibilities. And we had a great relationship. In LA, there was not that kind of an infrastructure for communities. And they had just instituted a neighborhood planning sort of process, but neighborhood planning groups did not correspond with community plans, and their charge was much more than planning. And so it was difficult to have a place to really interact with communities. So communities in Los Angeles were a good deal more frustrated, and it was harder with communities in Los Angeles to build trust and to reach consensus.
Yeah, that sounds like a completely different job.
Yes. I think one of my first experiences in Los Angeles was attending my first planning commission hearing. And in LA, there were 7 planning commissions, one citywide and others that represented larger geographic areas of the city. So I went to my first city planning commission where large projects that had citywide impacts would be heard. Yeah. And I'm sitting at the staff table, and during public testimony, a city council person arrived to speak to the planning commission to urge their vote on a project that ultimately would go to the city council, and I was a little stunned. This was not something that would happen in San Diego. So I was struck very quickly by the political environment I had found myself in.
Can you tell me a bit more about some of your kind of core beliefs or values that you've integrated into your planning work? Well,
I think 2 things. One is, and I think I mentioned it before, planners planners have to use the expertise of a lot of other people. We're not the experts. We're the people who bring transportation people and housing people and economic development people all collectively together to create either plans or policies. And so I think the ability to work with other groups, to bring them in, and to get them to help you to be successful. I think that I've always been good at getting people to help me, and I think that is a skill that benefits any planner. Making sure that you bring people in who can provide the expertise that you need, and I think being duly appreciative of their contributions to what you're doing. I think the other thing that's always been a core belief of mine is community engagement. So I believe strongly in community engagement, no matter how hard it is. I believe that planners need to speak to the people who are most directly impacted by the policies or plans that you're putting forward. And I think we need to be respectful of communities and understand that no one understands a neighborhood better than the people who live there. And I think respecting that while so many of our plans are future oriented, they're to take care of the needs of the future, we must not forget that those plans have to include some benefits for the people who live there now. It's a little unfair to go into a community and say, we're making all of these changes for people who are going to be here in 20 years, and their response is, what about me? Mm-hmm. And if you haven't thought of that in advance, I think it's going to be problematic for you.
Yeah, for sure. Can you tell us about another time maybe your values were tested, kind of a challenge that you went through?
Yeah. Well, I think, as I have mentioned, the whole political process in Los Angeles, but by the way, it's probably true in most planning departments today, because I think that it's much more common to find a strong mayor form of government. It just seems to be a much more popular government form today. I think for planners to fully understand what their role is, and that while our job is to come up with policies and plans and advise and recommend, we're not the decision makers. And I think that's a challenge for many, many planners. I have often reminded planners, if you want to make the decision, run for office. Because it is a political decision in the end, and the decision makers have to weigh not only your planning perspective, they have to weigh political considerations, economic considerations. And so I think it's important when we create plans and we create policy recommendations that we need to think about how that fits into a political environment. So thinking about how can you frame a policy in a way to make it appealing to a decision maker, to make them want to do it, and also to recognize that you have a responsibility also to bring them a comfort level from the community. Because if you can bring them a community that likes your idea or is in favor of your plan, it makes it much easier. So I think a challenge is, I've heard so many planners say, I hate politics. And I go, oh my God, why did you choose planning? I mean, it's all about politics. So, for me, it's sort of strategic thinking about how do you make it appeal to politicians. But I think that's a huge challenge for planners, to how to fit into a political environment.
Yeah, you're kind of touching on this, but thinking more broadly about the planning profession. I guess that's maybe something we need to work on in the planning profession. What do you think is going really well?
Yeah. Well, I think that I think we're learning more and more from our educational institutions about technical issues around planning. And I'm going to give an example because it's been on my mind recently. I worked a lot in Los Angeles with a professor at UCLA named Donald Shoup. And Donald Shoup taught me so much about parking and the impact of parking on planning. I mean, recognizing that our biggest challenge is how do we accommodate a growing population, or we think that's our biggest challenge. But truly, our challenge is how do we accommodate all the cars that the growing population brings with them? Mm-hmm. And parking is a huge burden to development, and interacting with universities and hearing from them with research, I think has been extremely helpful for us. I'm not sure why we don't take more advantage of what we can learn from universities, especially in areas that we don't think about as a particularly important planning skill. I'll give you two examples because I'm always harping on these two things that planners need to know. Planners, from my perspective, don't know enough about development financing. And when we create policies that aren't financially feasible, we're doomed from the beginning. So understanding whether or not your policy or your plan can be implemented, I think is really important. And I think we used to rely on folks from our redevelopment agencies, or at least I did, to help me with those things. Without that expertise, then I think planners need to know more. And the other thing is communication. I mean, we have great schools that teach communication, and we don't necessarily emphasize that with planners. And communicating in this new environment that we're in today with social media, and I have to say the lack of civility is a particular challenge. And planners typically, right out of school, come into that environment totally unprepared. And knowing how to deal with a difficult crowd, how to turn things around, how not to cry in public, as I often, caution my planners, not good to cry when you're on the stage. So, communication skills, development financing skills, I think could really help planners a lot.
So narrowing in a little bit to California, you mentioned parking, but are there any other specific issues you think we're facing in the profession?
I think the biggest issue that we're facing that's different today than when I came into the profession. I came in 1988, and we were doing subdivisions. We were doing large-scale development on raw land. And I have to say it was a heck of a lot easier. And it was easier to provide infrastructure and schools and parks when you were dealing with a developer who's building thousands of houses. Today, our challenge is how do you accommodate growth in existing neighborhoods and existing communities? And, I have to say there was a little bit of comfort in the old days that you could create thousands of houses and you had no community that you had to deal with. And today, every development, or most of the developments, have a community that feels very impacted. And that's a whole new challenge in California. And I think that that's the greatest challenge. How do we do that? How do we do that sensitively? How do we do that with respect to the communities that currently exist? How do we do that respecting the character of neighborhoods? I how do we implement new development in existing communities with a lot more consideration to urban design. I think that's a challenge in California, creating opportunities for growth in existing neighborhoods.
We've talked a lot about the challenges facing planners today, and it can be a tough profession. Do you have any tips or survival skills that you would recommend for people?
Well, I think not taking yourself too seriously is really important, being able to laugh and keep perspective. One of my particular practices that helped me was that I very often, after a difficult city council meeting, would go home, turn it on television with a glass of wine, and respond maybe a little more directly to the questions when I was alone with my wine. But I do think laughing and smiling and creating a team culture with other planners. I mean, being able to commiserate when you have things not go well, and to be able to celebrate collectively when things do go well, and to sometimes recognize the incremental nature of planning, that sometimes the small successes are the ones that lead you to the big wins.
So what do you think have been the challenges of being a woman in planning?
Oh, well, I was the first woman planning director in San Diego and in Los Angeles, and I have to say, I did not find it that much of a challenge within the department because, honestly, most of the planners are women. And so being head of the planning department within my department, I found that the planners were very accepting of a woman as director. It's a bit more challenging as you are interacting with other department heads. And I can remember, for instance, in San Diego, that the general manager and his floor that had all of the heads of the departments, and my interactions there were more interesting because they were all men. And I will say that it helped a lot that I was a bit older, and that I also have a sense of humor, and I have the ability to say hard things to men in with more of a sense of humor that I think make it a little more palatable. But I did find that there was a bias against women with those men, that they were used to dealing with men, and it was a bit of a challenge. And this was a number of years ago. I think that it has hopefully changed a good deal, but I would be present and hear jokes that were inappropriate, and I will assure you that I called them on it every single solitary time. I advised them on taking remedial diversity training and helped, suggested where they could go to be a little more enlightened. So my sense of humor, I think, helped a lot. But it was a challenge more in those days, I think, and I'm talking, 25 years ago. So that was a bit of a challenge. I think in LA, there were more women who were heads of departments. And I think the biggest challenge is if you're a woman in that position, you need to be willing to stand up for yourself. You need to be willing, if you're not comfortable telling hard truths, if you're not comfortable sitting down with an elected official and saying this is not okay, then you're going to be in trouble. And I'm a big believer that there are some jobs that you can't do well if you need them, and you need to remember that sometimes you have to do and say things that jeopardize your job, and you got to be sturdy enough to do that.
Yeah. So I'm actually originally from Canada and just relocated to San Diego a few years ago. And I've noticed quite a few differences in the planning profession. Can you speak to that at all? Have you experienced
Well, first,
that?
just let me say I love Canada. I love Canada so much that I consider living there occasionally. I think we were very lucky here in San Diego to have Canadian developers come to our downtown and develop buildings that were very similar to what they were building in Canada. And recognizing that our downtown was very similar to some of their experiences in Canada. But they were the ones who came to San Diego and took a risk in building high-rises, because we had been unsuccessful in convincing our local developers to build high-rises downtown. I think that they also were undaunted by our regulations. I mean, while a lot of our local developers complain constantly about the process and what they have to go through, the Canadian developers were very open to coming here and doing what they had to do, and they set the example and were, you know, they led the way, and then local developers sort of followed along. But we can attribute a lot of what you see in downtown San Diego to wonderful Canadian developers, so we welcome them.
So recently, the state has been coming down with a lot of policies, particularly in the realm of housing. As planners, how do you think that we can respond to this appropriately?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we should do is recognize why they're doing it. And they're basically doing it because local jurisdictions are not. I do not love statewide policies. I think it is extremely difficult to create a policy for an entire state, especially in housing. But I do recognize that local jurisdictions have struggled to create policies that really create the kind of density that the state needs. And so I'm a little unsympathetic to the locals who are screaming about it, because if we were doing it, they wouldn't have to. I think we are challenged always by creating policies that cover a large, both geographic and diverse area. And I can say that the exact same challenges exist in a city like Los Angeles, that is both large and very diverse. And I watched our attempts in Los Angeles to create citywide policies with the same reception that statewide policies are getting. But one of the things that struck me in Los Angeles was that there is the opportunity, when you have a large, diverse community, either a state or a city, that there are opportunities to try out new things and new ideas in a much more focused approach and in a specific area. And I used to say in Los Angeles that one of the wonderful things about Los Angeles is that whatever great planning idea you had, I could find a community in Los Angeles that would embrace it. Not the whole city, but a community or a neighborhood. And one of the examples I like to use is that one of the most successful policies that was adopted in Los Angeles that has produced the most amount of housing is the adaptive reuse ordinance. And that's the ability to take an old industrial building and make it very easy to convert it to residential without a lot of new requirements for parking and so forth. That policy was first embraced by a single neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles. Not all of downtown, a single neighborhood. Within a short period of time, it was so successful in that neighborhood that the rest of downtown saw it, and sometimes you have to see it, and embraced it, and we expanded the policy. The adaptive reuse ordinance was expanded to all of downtown. A few months, a year later, communities around the downtown also saw, we could do that, a great opportunity. And it expanded to a few of the community planning areas that were adjacent to downtown. Fast forward today, the adaptive reuse ordinance is citywide. We could never have sold that ordinance as a citywide ordinance in the beginning. Never. It would never have been accepted. But it grew. And it grew from one neighborhood to an entire city. And I think that pilot projects are a wonderful way to introduce planning ideas into a community where you actually can see it and experience it.
Yeah. So now that you're retired, what have you been working on?
Yeah, well, I will start by saying that my children have been very clear that I am the worst example of retirement that they have ever seen. I have totally failed retirement. When I retired as planning director from the city of Los Angeles, I had not expected initially to have a planning job again, but within a short period of time, I reluctantly took on the role of executive director of the Urban Land Institute in LA. And while I promised them 6 months, I actually stayed 6 years. And then immediately at the end of that, came back to San Diego, again, expecting not to work. Within a month, I took on the role of director of the board of the Metropolitan Water District in Los Angeles as a representative from San Diego. And I have to say that when I was called and asked to take on that role, my immediate response was, I'm a planner, water? What do I know about water? Well, it's now been 6 years and I know a heck of a lot about water, but I also found that my planning skills have been very valuable in that environment. And as vice chair of the board, part of my portfolio is a long-range climate adaptation plan for water. And as you probably know, the Metropolitan Water District provides imported water to all of Southern California, 19 million people. So planning for how we're going to have water in this new environment that we're in with climate change is a bit of a challenge, and I can assure you that planning skills are coming in very handy there.
What do you see kind of with APA? Where is the value in some professional organization like that?
Well, I always recommend to my planners, and I have always treated my planners like my family. I mean, I really do. And I always recommend to them that it's important for you to belong to the professional organization for your specific profession. It's a place where you'll learn from other people, you'll learn from other places. It's a place where you can grow. It's a place where you find opportunities. You network and can find opportunities for growth. I've learned a lot from APA. I have particularly learned from going to conferences. I think that it has helped me to develop better leadership skills and also to meet people who inspire me. The speakers who are either from other planning departments or educational institutions or, dare we say, developers, because I love developers. And I do have to pitch that a lot of planners are a little suspicious of developers, and I remind them all the time that if you don't create a plan that a developer can pick up and build, you failed, because our job is not to build plans, it's to build communities. So meeting developers at APA, meeting people who are doing really good things, watching the award ceremony, and being inspired by what other communities are doing. I think all of those things. And I really urge planners to get their certification. And in both of the planning departments that I led, I made sure there were incentives, that there were financial incentives for folks to get their AICP. Because if you care about your profession and you want to be the best, then I think that's an important step for planners to take. And then if you are fortunate enough to be considered for FAICP, it's a lovely group of people that even in my retirement, I meet with them regularly, and we share ideas and our opinions about what things are going on now. So it's great fun. So I'm a big fan of APA.
Great. And my last question, what is something that people might not know about you?
Oh my gosh. I have to say, I think I'm an open book. I think I've been described as motherly in planning, so I tend to be reasonably open. So I think people pretty much know my story. I think that one of the things that surprises people who meet me maybe in Los Angeles is knowing that I didn't start my planning career until I was 44. So, you know, I was the oldest junior planner in San Diego's planning department history, I think. But, you know, I suspect that that is something that surprises people. I was extremely fortunate, and but it's never too late to start a career. And if you're passionate about it and you love it and you find it fun, I think you'll do well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming in and speaking with
Thank
me today.
you.
Yeah, it's nice to
It
meet
was
you.
so fun to meet you too.